version control, databases, continuous integration, keeping trunk deployable, security, all of this stuff. But none of that actually really matters if you can't keep the product running. So just some examples. I've made all of these mistakes. Somebody calls you and says, hey, the site's down. And you have no idea what they're talking about. You're like, oh, okay, I could go look at that. And a little bit later, you realize it ran out of space. Okay, it's back now. It's not very professional.
Classic.
This happens to everybody. This has happened to me many times. Actually, at one place I was working, we made this a standard part of our sysadmin interview. Not actually a system running out of space, disk space, because that would be too obvious, but we ran it out of inodes. And let me tell you, no matter how good of software you've written, it acts crazy when it runs out of space. You won't believe where the symptoms show up.
It's usually so crazy, though, that you know it ran out of space.
You start to pick up on it, like, I can't explain this. Check the space.
Code can't possibly be doing this.
Right.
Did you run out of this space?
How much better would it be if instead of somebody calling you that the site was down, you called them and said, hey, we're doing capacity planning. We're growing at this much a month based on a 3-month average. And by the way, we're going to have to rebuild the entire system in 18 months. And they throw money at you.
Is that really how it goes?
You push out a new feature to your product, and people start reporting all of these crashes. Like, what? It worked in dev, it's working in testing. Maybe they're not using it correctly. How much better would it be if you could say, oh yeah, I already know about that. We've seen 37 this morning, it's only people with Cyrillic names. We should have a fix in an hour. Like all of these kinds of, these are very different responses, but with just a little bit of information, you can totally change how professionally you're perceived, but also actually how professionally you are building things. The other thing you can do is, what you're really doing is you're reprioritizing work in real time based on business impact rather than arguing with people who don't know a lot about the software, about potentially edge case bugs. Because the other thing you can do is say, yeah, it's happened once, and we've had 100,000 people come through, and it's happened once. I'm sorry it was the person you were talking to, but it can't derail this other stuff. This is one of my favorite ones. Somebody's like, oh, the site seems slow. Somebody told me the site seems slow. So a typical response is like, you go, well, okay, we've been fixing a lot of bugs. I have no idea. If you say it's slow, I guess we'll drop everything and go look at it. And even if you argue about it, nobody's going to believe you. But if you can say, that's interesting. Our 99th percentile page load time has improved over the last 3 months. So show me what seems slow and we'll figure it out. We'll actually really analyze it. This will result in a lot better decisions about spending. And you end up actually having a conversation about the truth rather than about perception. A really funny thing happened on one of my sites. Currently work on a product that's managing some medical records, and so we have intrusion detection systems running on the network. And we did some work on performance optimization and then went on to other things. 3 months later, our page load time mysteriously dropped by half. It wasn't that much before, but it mysteriously dropped by half. So we went back to our monitoring systems and lined up all of the changes and figured out, actually, that was when we upgraded the intrusion detection system. Without the graphs, we would have never had any idea what was going on. Been chasing ghosts. So you need monitoring. It's exciting because if you do monitoring, it means you get to buy lots of monitors. But one anti-pattern that happens a lot when people first set this up is thinking that they need to be sitting there looking at the monitors all the time. And you shouldn't. You should buy the monitors, and those are good, and use them for exploration and analysis. But humans are terrible at watching computers. You should never have anybody be getting in trouble because they didn't look at a graph that day or feel like they need to constantly check it and refresh it. So keep this point in mind later. There's like this whole inception point where the monitor watches the monitor, and it's really cool, but people should not be watching these graphs. The other principle that I try and use as a guiding principle with this is that it should be impossible for your boss, your investors, your users to be the first to notify you. Now, you might not have looked at the notification yet, but when you hear about a problem and you go start looking at the system should have already tried to warn you. And that's important because your job is to respond, not to react. So in this, there's all of these people who are reacting, but there's one person that's actually thinking about things and responding to the problem. So you need some other things too, like playbooks and rehearsals, but this talk is mostly focused about awareness. So, awareness means monitoring. What is monitoring? There's kind of three big things. The first is what we usually think of when we talk about monitoring, and that's basically a check running that says things are critical, or there's a warning, or it's okay, a tri-state check. But that on its own isn't nearly enough. You also need trending over time. If you have trending over time, you can then do event correlation and start doing capacity planning and some of those other things. And because humans shouldn't be watching this all the time, you need alerting. So alerting covers a whole variety of things. It could be putting an event in the audit log. It could be waking somebody up for an emergency. It could be opening a ticket to be looked at. It really just depends on your system, but all of those kind of count as alerting. So what can we monitor? The thing we always think about is, I can monitor my disk space. We can monitor open database connections, our page load time. Really cool thing to do is to count your HTTP status codes and the rate of change of those. If you're really good, you'll be monitoring things like, did your backups actually happen? If you're really, really good, you'll be monitoring whether your restores work. There's a lot of products out right now that do what's called real user monitoring, and where you're actually not just measuring your server performance, but measuring the experience that your users are having out on the edge. So you can know not just how long it takes your server to render a page, but how long it takes that page to finish displaying on a particular type of device on a 3G network. You can also suck in metrics from other places. And that's really cool because it lets you can start doing remixing. So a really frivolous example would be like YouTube likes. An example much closer to my heart would be like pulling in the metrics off of your AWS load balancers, right? If you get all of those into the same system as the rest of your application metrics, you can compare them much more easily. And then where the rest of the company usually gets excited is you can actually do the top one, which is business or application level metrics. You can do revenue, signups, cancellations, every different kind of engagement you can possibly imagine. And they all run basically on the same thing. So for a lot of people, a blank sheet of paper is paralyzing. There's so many options out there for this, it can get really complicated. So I'll give you some very opinionated recommendations. Use Sensu, use Graphite, use PagerDuty. But that's my recommendations. The big thing that matters is that you use something. There's a bunch of software as a service alternatives available: Pingdom, Zirconis, Gomez, New Relic, Librado metrics. But the important thing is that you use something. So tonight I'm going to show you about setting up Sensu and Graphite. The other consideration is when you're making this choice is really, do you want to spend time or money? So maybe you're a lean product, a lean startup. You've just got a contract developer. Just use a bunch of SaaS products. It's a valid approach. You just need a credit card. It's not quite as flexible, but it gets you a really long way in one day. If you're managing any financial data or medical records or anything like that, then you've really got to think twice about using some of those products. For me, a big question is, do you have full-time devs on the project? If the answer is yes, you should really consider running some of your own monitoring tools, because the business folks love them too, and it doesn't take that much work to run. It gives you a lot of flexibility. So to run your own, you need these things, and tonight I'm going to show you the top part, which is the Graphite and Sensu part. PagerDuty does the alerting, so it can handle on-call rotation if you happen to be lucky enough to share that with people. Logstash will also gather up all of your system logs and application logs, so that's really important, but I'm not going to cover that tonight. And then I like using Vagrant and Chef for configuration management, but that's too much to fit in one presentation. So Sensu and Graphite. Sensu is a monitoring framework. It's also called a monitoring router. If you've been around the ops world for a while, you might remember Nagios. And Nagios is really terrible in a cloudy architecture. And what does that mean? When you add a new service or a new check or a new server, you have to reboot Nagios. So that doesn't really play well when you're using an auto-scaling AWS group, or when you're doing multiple code deploys per day and any one of those could potentially add a new metric that you're monitoring. Any of that stuff. It turns it into a nightmare. So Sensu is just a modern reinterpretation of the same old thing, doing monitoring. And it's been written to be compatible with all the existing Nagios checks. So there's a really rich ecosystem of checks to pull from. And then Graphite is a time series database. So time series database basically means a thing that draws graphs. It was originally written at Orbitz. It's really, really flexible and I'm surprised at how popular it's gotten. So GitHub actually has somebody full-time working on Graphite now. It's totally open source. It happens to be written in Python. There are clients for every language out there. I'll show you one for Ruby. And it's really, really flexible. So it doesn't just draw a graph of the metric that you sent it. You can do math on it. You can remix those graphs. You can use wildcards in your queries. So we'll get more into this, but you can do some really, really fancy things with it. Just like Sensu, one of the powerful things about Sensu was that it handles new things waking up, showing up, new checks being pushed. Graphite, the same way. You don't have to hard code which metrics you're measuring. You set up Graphite with authentication or without, and when new metrics start getting pushed to it, it just starts showing up. So it's really, really nice. It's fantastic when your dev can go, hey, we added a new feature, we want to measure engagement on that feature, and they don't have to go ask you to change your monitoring architecture.
So like a demo or something that listens for
Yep.
config command or something?
So it just, what you send it to Graphite is a triplet of metric name, value, and timestamp. And so the name is a dotted string, and it just is magic. It just picks it up. Yeah. So they've got the
Graphite as a service.
there is Graphite as a service stuff, hostedgraphite.com, I think.
Most business opportunity.
There's a lot of business opportunities. I don't think anybody's running Sensu as a service yet, so let's start there.
I like that.
So Sensu, Sensu is a monitoring framework, RabbitMQ, and then it's got a little dashboard there, so you can do really useful things like disable a set of checks so that it doesn't spam your phone while you're working on a server or doing some other scheduled maintenance. And then you run a lightweight client on your various machines, so that's the top right corner, and they run checks. So those checks can be scheduled by the server or they can run independently. If you have any scale at all, it's really important that they be able to run independently. But inevitably, there's going to be something that you need to coordinate centrally, so Sensu can handle both. From the left are handlers. So, and then on the right are the client plugins. The client plugins can either be checks or metrics. So checks have the dotted line, okay, warn, or critical. Checks are the tri-state. Metrics are a value, and you draw a picture of them. And then depending on the event, you might want to use different handlers. So an example of that check is the website up? It's either yes, the website is up, or warn, the website is up, but it took more than 10 seconds. Or fail, I didn't get a response even after the 30-second timeout. And if you get a critical response, what do you want to do with it? It depends on your business. Maybe it goes to a ticketing system, maybe it needs to page you. Maybe those rules change depending on what day of the week it is. So if it's the demo system that's used by the sales team, you want to get paged during business hours, but if it's on the weekend, it's the demo system, nobody cares. Another important principle to use with these things is that you really want to avoid alert fatigue. So inevitably, like the pendulum swings too far when you first set it up, and you alert on everything because it's so cool that it can tell you, and then by that night, you're sick of it, and you're like just acting all the alerts, and then the next day you turn them all off. Yeah. Another handler is the Graphite handler. So those are where metrics go. Those are the green boxes on the bottom. You can write other handlers, and you can also write mutators, but really, sending it to PagerDuty or sending it to Graphite is the key use cases. So Graphite, hosted Graphite. I just stole a screenshot off of their front page because it showed the pictures of graphs. It's a time series database, and you can see up here that this is actually showing a bunch of lines, and that they're all together on the same screen, and these are relative to each other. You can combine and time shift and do all of this stuff. So like, it's one thing to look at a graph of a traffic pattern. It's a totally different thing to look at that superimposed over the same traffic pattern last month, last shopping season, and then you can add in your own events. It's also very hard for humans with your eye brain or your optical nerve to detect changes in slope on a graph. So if it's a flat line, I can tell if it's sloping or not sloping. But if it's a slope, it's very hard for me to tell the degree of change in that slope. So how do you do things like your service lets people upload photos, and so you have space being consumed all the time. How do you know if the rate of growth of your product is changing? That's really an interesting thing, right? Is growth slowing down? Is growth speeding up? Graphite has all these cool math functions in there, so you can run a derivative of a graph, and it should be, if the rate stays the same, it's flat, and if the rate is increasing, it goes up. And it makes it really, really easy to do comparative analysis. And you can decide all of those things when you're sending queries, not at the time that you're recording the data. So you get to make those decisions when you're analyzing, not ahead of time when you're setting up the system. So back to events for a minute. They don't just come from checks. You can also have some events that you inject into the system. And those give additional context. So some examples there on the top. The deploy happened. I sent a marketing email. There was a press release from the NSA. A server went offline. All of these events, these points in time, add tremendous amounts of context to the slopes on those graphs that we were looking at on the previous screen. So you might record those events in an audit log or in a ticket. You might overlay them on the graph. You might escalate them to PagerDuty. When you overlay on the graph, rather than it just being a dot, Graphite has this really cool thing called draw as infinite. And so it makes it a straight line across the graph. You can have a little label on it. It's really cool. And then the events probably come from you. You could hook up a button that lets, on a web page, that's like a single text box and lets somebody record an event. But the metrics are probably where your business people really start to get involved. So they can figure out like what the various user engagement stats are that they want to watch. And then this is the part that I just have so much fun with. Remember how I said that humans should not be watching computers, computers should be watching computers? You can wire a Sensu check. Remember, a check says, okay, warning, critical. You can wire a check against the parameters of a graph in Graphite. So you can say, if my 500 error rate goes vertical, page me. And you'll know about it before anybody else in the company does, or at the same time as everybody else knows. If you were getting 1,000 uploads an hour and it dropped to 0, even if the front page is loading, even if your user engagement things are right, you want to know that. And so that's really cool, where you can actually be pumping business level metrics into Graphite, your time series, and then wire your Sensu checks against that to warn you if things get too far outside the acceptable range. So how do you publish metrics from your app? I mentioned Graphite, but really, I don't think you would ever run Graphite without StatsD. So StatsD is like 500 lines of code. It was written by the folks at Etsy. It's a statistics aggregator. And what it does is just makes it way easier to measure correctly. So it wraps a little bit of logic around the counts that you publish and gives you much richer output. So for example, you are measuring user signups. So every time a user signs up, you say, boop, got a user sign up. Send one of those triplets over. StatsD catches it and will not only track the count, it will give you the rate, the per second rate. If you're doing timers or measuring some other quantity, it will do histograms. It will give you the 90th and 50th and 99th, if you want it, percentile of your numbers. So you can actually do real analysis rather than struggling with like fundamental elementary statistics errors. So there's client libraries from every language you can think of. I'll show you the statsd Ruby gem, and it's really one line of code. So here's a bunch of different examples. On line number 2, you're creating a new statsd client. By default, it's using UDP, so this actually isn't like opening a persistent connection or anything. It's just pointing it at a target. There's some debate, depending on your app architecture, your data center architecture, about whether you run the statsd daemon next to your app server or next to the Graphite server. You can do both. They're both very popular. And then the data that you're sending is a triplet of metric name, count, and timestamp. So it handles the timestamp automatically. You tell it the metric name. And these are counters, so it's just incrementing by 1, just saying add 1. So you can see some examples there in the middle of different counters you might want to run. What happened, like, are you getting attacked by spammers? You might get, like, see your password reset submissions spike. There's some really interesting things you can do here. You can imagine, like, the sky's the limit in what you can actually count once you have this basic infrastructure in place. And anybody can drop in just one line of code to do that. Time is really interesting, not just for timing. It's also good for anything that you're trying to get histograms of. So anything that gives you a count back, you can use the timer function with, and it gives you those percentiles, the mean, the sum, the count, and the upper and lower values, all for free. So it's still one line, but statsd is like doing all of this nice stats stuff around it. So that was publishing graphs into Graphite. This is making a Sensu check plugin. So there's a whole bunch out there in the community that you can pull from. There's a community plugins repository. This is a very, very simple one of a check for machine load. So at the top, we derive from the Sensu wrapper class. By the way, you can write these in any language you want. It just so happens that there's a very nice Ruby library for it. There is an adapter for generic command line. So your command line can return 0, 1, or 2. And if you've already gotten a check written, you can plug it in very easily. But if you're going to write your own, Ruby's the way to go. And you feed in some options, and you define a run method. In your run method, you figure out whether things are okay or not. And then you call either the critical method, the warning method, or the okay method. And so you can see there on lines 19, 20, and 21, it's just checking the parameters that were passed in for what the check should be, and either critical, warning, or okay. So this Sensu plugin is for a metric. So remember, the check tells you it's okay or not. The metric draws the graph. So this is going to publish one of those counter triplets. So just like we derive from a different base class, still give it an option. So the option here is saying if you want to prepend any special naming scheme that fits in with how you've defined your tree of metrics inside Graphite. And then you define a run method.